That's wonderful. Sounds like a fan club. You make me feel so welcome and special. That's nice. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming to the room and also the audience joining us online. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. And like we said, I'm going to talk about digitalization as a tool for more inclusive internationalization and share some perspectives from South Africa with you. And South Africa has kind of like been on the cards. We're really flying the South African flag high. Those of you who were there yesterday, there were two speakers who drew on South African context and experiences. And we had another colleague here who's in the room, which is wonderful, from the South African Qualifications Authority. So I would just like to ask into this room, obviously I can't unfortunately interact with the online audience, but can you just by show of hand tell me how many of you have an idea of what the South African context of higher education looks like? Do you have engagements? Have you visited? Do you work with institutions in the country? Okay, so there's not a whole lot of knowledge, which I think means that I should give you a little bit of background on the South African context so that you kind of like understand a little bit better where I'm coming from and why some of the things that I say might be important. So South African higher education internationalization is really a relatively new thing. We've been really doing this since 1994. Why is 1994 an important date? Well, it was the end of apartheid and the beginning of democracy in the country. And so internationalization after the end of academic boycotts really kind of like gained momentum after 1994. So that's not even 30 years. It's something that I think is really important to take into account. What is also important is that even though internationalization has been advanced in the country, it's been very uneven, which means we can't take for granted that all the universities in the country are at the same level of internationalization, have the same resources to implement internationalization activities, etc. And that is something that is very, very important because it's a legacy of colonialism and particularly apartheid that we deal with. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized segregation, racial segregation and discrimination against Black South Africans in all spheres of life, and that of course includes higher education and includes universities. And universities were treated very unequally. So they were so-called white institutions and black institutions and institutions for the Indian and the colored populations. Those are the apartheid classification of population groups. And unfortunately, even though apartheid as a formal system does no longer exist, the legacies of that system exist to this day, and this is something to take into consideration. So inequality is really, that's why I gave it one extra bullet. It's something that we have to constantly be mindful of when we talk about higher education and internationalization in the South African context. And so that inequality is something that is visible at the level of institutions. So to this day, for example, we distinguish historically advantaged and historically disadvantaged institutions. Those are institutions, the advantaged institutions, generally formerly white universities that received a lot more attention in terms of funding, in terms of resources, in terms of infrastructure. And not surprisingly, those are the institutions that are doing fairly well when it comes to internationalization as well. They are the ones who are internationally linked, they have partners, they have funding to support students and staff in their endeavors, etc. And then we also see these levels and the range of inequality at the level of individuals. We have some students who don't need international officers because they can afford to go and do study abroad year wherever they want to be. But the majority of South African students depend on national funding to fund their studies in the country. And there are real study abroad funding programs from any national authority or the ministry. So getting students abroad, for example, is a real challenge. And very often in that context where we have inequality and where we have resource constraints, internationalization then becomes a very privileged endeavor that is often perceived as something that really only benefits the select few. Few people, few students, few staff members who get to experience and have an international exposure, and also few institutions. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So this is the starting point of before we even talk about digitalization in higher education and higher education internationalization, we have to kind of like understand the context a little bit more and the constraints and the starting point for a discussion. So what I want to share with you today is really two examples. I thought, I'll just reflect a little bit on the institutions that I've worked with, and perhaps to explain the organization that I represent is the International Education Association of South Africa. It's a national association that works with universities in the country, public universities in the country, of which we have 26. So compared to the German system of higher education or many other systems, it's a relatively small sector with 26 institutions. Those institutions are quite varied and differentiated in terms of types. So we distinguish between research-intensive universities, for example, comprehensive universities, and universities of technology. These are just the three formal categories of institutions that you will find, and all of them are represented amongst IESA membership. So when I talk to you today, I draw on working with institutions in the entire sector, which is what my organization does and has been doing so since 1997. So I gave you 1994 as the end of apartheid. In 1997, so relatively early on, IESA was established mostly at the time out of the need of universities to deal with the influx of international students to South Africa. To this day, the majority of international students in South Africa are actually from the continent, or other African countries, particularly from the neighboring countries, but the rest of the continent. And then, of course, there are smaller groups of students who come from all around the world. But so to deal with that influx of students after the end of apartheid was why IESA was initially established. And now as an organization, of course, we're still there to deal with international student issues, but look at internationalization much more comprehensively. And it's all about international collaboration, research, teaching, learning, internationalization of the curriculum, and all of those conversations that I'm sure you will be very familiar with. So what I would like to just touch on is one project that was called Ikudu. And it's a project that was co-funded under the EU, the Erasmus Plus program, and particularly capacity building. Why I think it's important to mention this particular project is to illustrate, for example, that digitalization and collaborative online learning in particular is not something new in South Africa. It's not something that we only talk about since the pandemic, when we kind of had to put a stop to physical mobility and moving people around, etc. But it's really something that was born out of the need and the realization that in South Africa, mobility-based internationalization, which for many, I think, is the traditional type of international engagement. We're talking about moving people, creating opportunities for students to study elsewhere, etc. And this is something that never really worked in South Africa because of the system that I tried to just briefly outline, to say there is this huge level of inequality and poverty and resource constraints, which really make studying abroad almost impossible for students, definitely not for the majority of students. So the background to that was that a consortium of institutions applied to the EU for funding and was successful. And the tagline of this project was transforming curricula through internationalization and virtual exchanges. And so here they set out to develop a contextualized South African concept of internationalization of the curriculum, which deliberately integrates collaborative online international learning, or COIL, and virtual exchanges as an alternative to physical mobility. And that was really the realization that in the South African context, we can never even dream of moving most of our students and giving them a physical mobility experience. So we have to look for other ways to reach more students across the board, and collaborative online international learning is one way in which we can do that. I wrote down the partners that were involved in this project. University of the Free State is highlighted because they are the main coordinator, but you see Central University of Technology, Durban University of Technology, University of Limpopo, and University of Venda. Those of you who are familiar with this, with the South African sector, would realize that these institutions is quite an interesting mix, because it's universities that are known as research-intensive universities that are quite well established established. The University of the Free State is one of those former white universities in the country. But it also includes universities of technology and 2 universities that are based in rural areas of the country, which are often the ones that are totally left out of internationalization conversations because, it's just too difficult to travel. They don't appear in global rankings, etc. So they are not normally the institutions that get approached for projects. So at that level, this consortium is already interesting from a South African perspective. And then, of course, you see a number of European partners here as well. If you know people from these institutions, or just look up on their websites, they all have information about the program. I don't want to go into all the details, but there is some information that's available. I shared the link to the website with you. And the second example that I want to talk about is one of the universities that has really become a COIL champion, if I can call it that, in the South African context. And that's the Durban University of Technology. Should sound familiar because it was one of the universities that is involved in this Ikudu project. What I think is really quite remarkable, that COIL work started at that institution in 2013, so that's about almost 10 years ago. They started implementing their first project in 2016, and this year they had 68 COIL projects across all the faculties. So this is one institution that I think very early on recognized that COIL offers us a possibility to spread the benefits of internationalization to all our students, linking it to the curriculum in all our subjects and everything that we offer at the institution. And so that really, I think, in itself is quite remarkable. What they've also done in addition to is not only that they've started rolling out these courses and rolled them out across the institution, but also started offering professional development courses to now say, and we've heard a lot, I mean, this is a fantastic place to be, I think, if you want to get inspiration and examples of what people do in so many diverse contexts around the world when it comes to actually implementing digital tools and digital methodologies in teaching. So in 2020, they developed this course at DUT, started rolling it out in 2021, firstly to their own staff members to say, how do you now go about setting up a COIL module or a course, etc. But they've also actually already started rolling it out internationally, particularly to partner universities that are involved in this Matariki network. And so I gave you that link as well. You can look that up and see which institutions are involved there. What I think is very encouraging from a South African perspective is that last year, in 2021, DUT won the Global Award for Innovation and Excellence in Internationalization. That was awarded by the Association of International Education Administrators. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them, the AIAA. And what is really interesting that it was in special recognition of their COIL efforts and their involvements internationally in terms of their partnerships with partners, particularly in the global north, but also elsewhere. And they were also able to be awarded a consultancy by the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and they developed a wonderful toolkit, virtual engagement for international student exchanges, which is freely available online. So I've given you that link. I'm sure these presentations will be shared with everyone afterwards, so you can look that up and see, what is their approach? How do they go about? What do they think they have learned in these almost 10 years that they've been engaged in these activities? And so I'm coming to my final reflections. I really wanted to leave some space for us to engage. And so I just want to share with you 2 main things, really. The one is that I think COIL and other methodologies have a really important role to play in advancing higher education internationalization in more equitable and inclusive ways. And this is really because of the potential to reach more students than the 1 or 2 students a year that have this wonderful opportunity to go and get a scholarship or whatever and go and study abroad and have that real international exposure. And this is a way in which, and when you speak to the people, the staff members and the students that have been involved in these, it is definitely an opportunity to engage very deeply. It's not a fleeting exercise. We have like a once-off engagement. We all log into this virtual meeting space and we just talk. It's really connected to student learning outcomes, etc. And there is a real exchange. I say real because I often hear that you can only have an immersion experience when you go somewhere. And I think I would never be someone to say that's not true, because I think it is. But the realization is, and the reality is that in our context, that kind of immersion is never going to be possible for everybody, and not even for the majority of our students and staff members. So we have to find alternative ways. And I think in that sense, digitalization and COIL and other initiatives offer a real good alternative to get international exchange, exchanging ideas, exchanging knowledge, exchanging approaches, reflecting on different contexts, and really creating that classroom that has, benefits from diverse perspectives. And I was just in a session now where they were talking about experiences of a German and Australian and US institution and bringing students together. And I think that's exactly what I mean. Secondly, and linked to that, I think digitalization generally now offers us a very important tool to reimagine internationalization. I think this is probably something that we all felt during COVID-19, when everything came to a halt literally overnight. We all felt it around the world, which I think is something that is very special. Because very often when we talk about challenges from a South African context, for example, now we don't have electricity. We have scheduled power outages where I have 3 slots a day, 3 2.5-hour slots where I have no power. Try to explain this to somebody internationally, we don't have to explain COVID. Everybody understands. It was really, of course, it was a differentiated experience, but it was an experience that we all shared. And I think that has really allowed us to kind of like enter a different level, a different phase in our international engagements. There's a lot more willingness to actually, and openness to engage with different contexts and what actually has worked and what hasn't worked. And so for me, a very important point is to say that in internationalization activities, we really have to move away from a focus on physical-based mobility activities. They're not sustainable. A sustainability argument can absolutely also be made, of course, in terms of environmental sustainability and the contribution to climate degradation that internationalization as a sector globally has caused. But it's also not sustainable in the way that if we want internationalization to be something that everybody can benefit and everybody deserves an international experience, then I think we have to really embrace digitalization and move away also from seeing it as a second-class kind of like alternative to doing the real thing, but really acknowledge it as something in its own right that offers us a lot of possibilities to engage and be global. And that's another thing that many universities, want to produce global citizens, students that are globally competent. And I do think that technology, of course, always with a proviso like we discussed yesterday, that it needs to be available to everybody. And of course, that digital divide that we talked about and the necessity to provide students then with laptops and data and internet access and electricity, that is, of course, a requirement to make all of that happen. But I think it is an encouraging sign. And being here at this conference, and that's where I'm going to leave it now, I think it's really very inspiring and encouraging to see how many different kind of initiatives and approaches and tools. I've heard so many tools that I have not heard of before. And that is really wonderful to be in a space like this. And that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Thank you so much.